August 6, 1942. Inside the humid air of Truk Lagoon, the Imperial Japanese Navy carrier Shōkaku sat motionless. Its flight deck, once alive with roaring Zero fighters, was silent. Below, in a dim, smoke-filled conference room, 5 Japanese admirals pored over maps, casualty reports, and grim intelligence summaries. For 3 hours they had spoken in circles, searching for hope in the numbers. None appeared. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, his voice low but steady, finally said what they all knew. "Gentlemen, the war is lost." No one argued. Silence was agreement. Exactly 2 months had passed since the Battle of Midway, the turning point that shattered Japan's naval power. The empire that had struck with lightning speed at Pearl Harbor was now realizing a terrible truth. The very attack that once promised dominance had sealed its fate. The illusion of triumph. 8 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's meticulously planned assault on Pearl Harbor achieved near-perfect tactical success. Japanese aircraft sank or crippled 8 U.S. battleships, destroyed nearly 200 planes, and killed over 2,000 Americans. Tokyo celebrated a glorious victory. But beneath the triumph lay fatal oversights. The U.S. aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. The fuel depots, submarine base, and repair yards were untouched. Within Japan's Navy, the more clear-sighted officers understood what that meant. The blow had wounded America, not killed her. Yamamoto, a realist among nationalists, reportedly told aides, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he said it or not, the sentiment was real. Japan's own intelligence predicted only 6 to 8 months of strategic advantage before American industry would tip the scales. By August 1942, that window had closed. Midway, the catastrophe. The Battle of Midway, fought in early June, was a catastrophe disguised as a battle. For fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were lost, along with over 100 experienced pilots. Japan entered the war with 10 first-line carriers. After Midway, only 6 remained, 2 of them under repair. The loss was not just of ships, it was of irreplaceable people. Japan's naval aviators were elite, trained through years of rigorous preparation. Their replacements were hastily schooled, their flight time barely a quarter of their predecessors. Meanwhile, U.S. training programs were producing thousands of new pilots every month. The balance of power in the skies shifted irreversibly. American industry, unleashed by rage and resolve, was already producing Essex-class carriers, larger, faster, and more advanced than anything in Japan's fleet. By 1944, the United States would possess a carrier force so vast that Japanese naval strategy would collapse into desperate defense. The war of numbers. In that meeting aboard Shōkaku, Japanese officers reviewed the raw arithmetic of defeat. In 1941, U.S. factories built 19,000 military aircraft. Japan built about 5,000. By 1943, projections showed America producing 85,000 a year, Japan maybe 16,000 at best. Every chart told the same story: exponential American growth versus Japanese stagnation. Behind the numbers were deeper structural flaws. Japan's wartime economy relied on imported oil, iron, and rubber. Its shipyards could not replace merchant vessels lost to American submarines. By mid-1942, Japan was losing 30 to 40 merchant ships a month, a rate that would cripple logistics within 2 years. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies were already declining. By 1943, they would fall to unsustainable levels. The admirals understood what this meant. They might still win battles, but they could no longer win the war. Strategic paralysis. Japan's early conquests, Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and countless Pacific islands, had created a defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles. It looked impressive on a map. In reality, it was a nightmare to defend. Every island required garrisons, supplies, and ships to maintain communication. America, on the other hand, could choose when and where to strike. Japan had to defend everywhere. Even with equal forces, that was a losing proposition. and forces were no longer equal. Some officers timidly raised the idea of negotiating peace, perhaps offering to withdraw from certain territories in exchange for a ceasefire. The suggestion drew bitter laughter. The intelligence summaries were clear. American public opinion, enraged by Pearl Harbor and atrocities in Asia, demanded unconditional surrender. A fatal miscalculation. As the meeting dragged on, the admirals examined how they had reached this point. Pearl Harbor had been a dazzling tactical strike, but strategically it was suicide. The plan had assumed that destroying America's Pacific Fleet would force Washington to negotiate. Instead, it united an entire nation. The attack also handed the United States the moral high ground. Because Japan's declaration of war was delivered after the bombs fell, due to a delay in decoding, it looked like a sneak attack, an act of treachery. America branded it a day of infamy, and the world believed it. In the months that followed, U.S. propaganda turned the Pacific War into a moral crusade. For Japan, every victory now deepened its isolation. Every loss accelerated its decline. Yamaguchi's voice cut through the smoke once more. "We thought we could shock America into peace. Instead, we have guaranteed total war." No one replied. There was nothing left to say. Shadows after Midway. The meeting aboard Shōkaku broke up quietly, each officer returning to his duties as if routine could mask despair. Yet beneath the disciplined silence, everyone knew the truth. The Empire had crossed a line from which it could not return. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi's comment, "The war is lost," was not defeatism. It was mathematics. Japan's resources, production, and manpower could not sustain a prolonged war against a nation with 10 times its industrial base and nearly double its population. In the corridors of the Imperial Navy, few dared to speak those words aloud. To question victory was treason. But within intelligence circles and logistics offices, whispers had begun. Japan could win battles, but it could not win the war. The American machine awakens. Across the Pacific, America had turned fury into industry. After Pearl Harbor, U.S. shipyards ran 24 hours a day. The Essex-class carriers, conceived before the war, were now being laid down in steel and rivets. Each ship displaced over 27,000 tons, carried nearly 100 aircraft, and could launch operations at a tempo Japanese planners could barely imagine. More devastating was America's mastery of logistics. While Japanese convoys were picked apart by submarines, the U.S. Navy created a global network of supply lines that could feed fleets anywhere on Earth. Tankers, repair ships, and floating dry docks followed the advancing carriers. Every American strike group was an industrial ecosystem, self-sustaining and mobile. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood the nature of the conflict perfectly. The enemy must be ground down by superior resources. He wrote in 1942, "This is not a war of tactics but of logistics." Japan's high command, still focused on decisive battles, could not grasp that truth. The human collapse. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the same pilot who had led the first wave at Pearl Harbor, attended the August meeting despite injuries from Midway. His report was brutal. Japan had begun the war with roughly 3,500 first-line carrier pilots. By mid-1942, 40% were dead. The replacement system was hopelessly inadequate. Training a carrier-qualified pilot before the war took up to 5 years and nearly 1,000 hours of flight time. Wartime acceleration reduced that to 1 year and barely 200 hours. The result was predictable. Inexperienced pilots were being thrown into combat against increasingly skilled American airmen. Fukuda's charts showed an unavoidable curve. At the current rate of attrition, Japan would exhaust its pool of veteran aviators by mid-1943. Once that happened, carriers would become floating coffins, powerful ships with no one capable of fighting from them. By contrast, the United States had turned pilot production into a mass operation. The Army, Air Forces, and the Navy were training tens of thousands of aviators every year, with standardized curriculums and mechanical simulators that allowed rapid skill development. Quantity was producing quality. To the admirals on Shōkaku, the implication was chilling. Even if Japan built new carriers, there would be no one left to fly from them. The invisible war under the sea. Japan's submarine doctrine had always focused on attacking enemy warships, not commerce. This decision, rooted in samurai-era ideas of honor, proved fatal. While Japanese subs stalked destroyers and cruisers, American submarines targeted merchant shipping. By mid-1942, the results were becoming catastrophic. Dozens of Japanese tankers, freighters, and transports were vanishing beneath the waves each month. The losses were not yet crippling, but the trend was unmistakable. Japan imported nearly all of its oil and a large share of its food. Every ship sunk tightened a noose that would eventually choke the empire's ability to fight. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue had warned of this danger even before Pearl Harbor. "Our greatest enemy is not the U.S. Navy," he told colleagues, "but the loss of our shipping lanes." His warning had been ignored. By August 1942, the statistics proved him right. American submarines were growing deadlier as torpedo defects were fixed and radar became standard. Japan's failure to adopt convoy tactics and its shortage of escort vessels magnified the disaster. Every month, fewer tankers reached the home islands, and more factories slowed for lack of fuel. The geography of overreach. In the first 6 months of war, Japan's conquests had been breathtaking. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and a chain of islands stretching across the Pacific. Newspapers called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But the empire's perimeter had grown too large for its means. Each new conquest created more coastline to defend, more airfields to supply, more garrisons demanding ammunition and rice. Japan had no infrastructure to sustain it. Supply convoys stretched thousands of miles, vulnerable to submarines and aircraft. Meanwhile, the Americans had adopted a new approach, island hopping. Rather than retaking every Japanese position, U.S. forces would seize key islands, build airbases, and bypass the rest, leaving them to wither in isolation. The plan had begun on a remote island few had heard of, Guadalcanal. In early August 1942, U.S. Marines landed there. To Japanese intelligence, it seemed a small intrusion. In reality, it was the start of an unbroken chain of offensives that would roll across the Pacific for the next 3 years. Misreading the enemy. Inside the Japanese command structure, a deeper failure persisted, a complete misunderstanding of American psychology. The architects of Pearl Harbor had assumed that the U.S., a democracy divided by isolationism, would sue for peace after a string of defeats. They had believed Americans lacked the endurance for total war. They were wrong. Pearl Harbor united the United States as nothing else could. It turned a reluctant nation into an industrial juggernaut driven by vengeance. Across the country, factories retooled overnight. Women filled assembly lines, building bombers and tanks. War bonds exceeded all expectations. The Japanese Navy's own intelligence briefings confirmed the worst. The American people were not discouraged by losses, they were enraged. Negotiation is impossible, one report concluded. Public opinion demands victory without compromise. For the admirals on Shōkaku, the emotional reality was irrelevant. What mattered was the consequence. America would not stop. The meeting's breaking point. By the third hour, the atmosphere in the room had grown heavy. The sound of ceiling fans mixed with the scratch of pencils. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike, finally spoke. "We misread the future," he admitted. "We fought to destroy battleships, when it was the carriers that mattered. We attacked to force negotiation, and instead gave them resolve." He paused, eyes fixed on the table map of the Pacific. "Pearl Harbor gave us 6 months of freedom. It will cost us everything else." Yamaguchi looked at him but said nothing. No one did. The silence that followed was the sound of realization, the moment when strategy turned into tragedy. The Doolittle catalyst. Admiral Yamaguchi shifted the topic to a document many wished to forget. The analysis of the Doolittle raid, April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, had struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The damage was trivial. A few fires, a handful of deaths. Yet the psychological effect was devastating. For the first time, Japan's people saw that their homeland was not invincible. Panic spread through Tokyo. Civilians fled to the countryside. The attack forced the military to divert aircraft and anti-aircraft units from the front lines to defend the home islands. Worse, the raid provoked rage at the highest levels. The Imperial Navy demanded immediate retaliation. The result was the Midway operation, a rushed, overly complex plan designed more to lure the U.S. carriers into battle than to achieve clear strategic goals. That decision, born of pride and emotion, had cost Japan for carriers and its best aviators. In retrospect, the Doolittle raid was the trigger that pushed Japan into the trap from which it could never escape. Cracks in the code. As the admirals continued their review, another issue surfaced. One that chilled every officer in the room. Intelligence failures. Reports from naval communications units suggested that American forces had anticipated Japanese moves too precisely at Coral Sea and Midway. Intercepted messages hinted that U.S. codebreakers might be reading Japan's most secure ciphers. The implications were catastrophic. If the enemy knew Japan's intentions before each battle, then no amount of bravery or planning could save them. Admiral Igaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, summarized the problem. Every fleet order we send may already be known to the Americans before it is executed. They were fighting a war with their maps visible to the opponent. Japan's intelligence network, though brave, lacked the technological sophistication to compete with American cryptanalysis. While Japan relied on human spies and slow message relays, the United States had harnessed electronic interception, dedicated teams, and computing machines like the IBM punch card system. By mid-1942, America's MAGIC program was reading large portions of Japanese diplomatic and naval traffic. The Japanese admirals aboard Shōkaku did not know the full extent of the compromise, but they suspected enough to lose confidence in their own communications. It was another silent front Japan was already losing, the economic trap. Next came a sobering report from the finance ministry. It projected Japan's economic endurance under several scenarios. Even under ideal conditions, with no major naval defeats and continued control of Southeast Asian resources, the empire could sustain full-scale war until late 1944. After that, collapse was inevitable. The reasons were structural. Japan's economy was not designed for prolonged total war. Industrial output depended on imports of iron ore from China, oil from the Dutch East Indies, and rubber from Malaya. Every one of these supply lines ran through waters increasingly dominated by U.S. submarines and aircraft. Oil was the core of the problem. Before the war, Japan imported over 90% of its petroleum. Seizing the Indonesian fields solved the shortage temporarily but created a new bottleneck: transportation. Tankers had to travel thousands of miles through hostile seas to reach Japan. Each month more of them were sunk. By August 1942, oil imports had already fallen by nearly 40%. By 1943, the Navy calculated fuel shortages would restrict carrier operations and flight training. A war fought without oil was a war already lost. Captain Fukuda spoke again, his tone grim. "We have oil fields but no way to bring the oil home. We will have ships without fuel, planes without gasoline, and soldiers without supplies." The psychology of denial. Despite overwhelming evidence, the admirals knew their conclusions would never reach the highest levels of command. The military government in Tokyo, driven by ideology and fear of internal dissent, refused to consider retreat or negotiation. Any suggestion that the war was unwinnable could be punished as defeatism or treason. The army leadership, controlling most of the cabinet, still believed that victory could be achieved through willpower and sacrifice. They pointed to past wars against China and Russia as proof of Japanese spirit. But those conflicts had been limited. This was a global industrial war. The result was paralysis. The Navy understood the scale of disaster but could not speak it. The Army denied it. And the civilian government, trapped between them, continued issuing slogans about divine destiny and eternal victory. One admiral muttered bitterly, "We are commanded to win with faith instead of fuel." No one laughed. The American advance. As the meeting dragged on, new reports arrived from the Solomon Islands. U.S. Marines had seized the unfinished Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal. The Navy was already building it into a forward base. From there, American bombers could strike deep into Japanese supply routes. The admirals studied the maps. Guadalcanal was not merely an island. It was the first link in a chain that could lead all the way to the Philippines and Japan itself. If the Americans established air superiority there, the defensive perimeter in the South Pacific would unravel. Admiral Yamaguchi understood the pattern. "They will not stop," he said quietly. "They will take one island, then the next, until they stand at our doorstep." He was right. Guadalcanal would mark the beginning of a relentless American strategy, methodical, industrial, and merciless. For every Japanese ship sunk, 3 more American ships arrived. For every pilot lost, the U.S. sent 10 replacements. The Empire of Japan was being outproduced, outsupplied, and outplanned. The final realization: the meeting reached its inevitable end. There was nothing more to analyze. The numbers spoke louder than any speech. The admirals had discovered the truth of their own empire's mortality. Yamaguchi proposed drafting a memorandum to the Naval General Staff, urging immediate consideration of a negotiated peace before collapse became irreversible. The others agreed privately, but none supported sending it officially. They knew what would happen. The message would be suppressed, and they would be accused of cowardice. So the document was never written. The officers returned to their posts, preparing for operations they no longer believed in. As they left the conference room, Yamaguchi paused at the doorway and looked back at the silent table covered with reports and maps. "We have already lost," he said softly. "The only question is how long we will take to admit it." Outside, the lagoon shimmered under the tropical sun. The great carrier Shōkaku rested at anchor, a symbol of power that was already fading. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, waited for the next battle. The empire in decline. By late 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was still formidable on paper, hundreds of warships, experienced commanders, and islands spanning half the Pacific. But inside every strategic briefing, the truth was clear. The empire was slowly bleeding out. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and stranded ships. Merchant convoys sailed with dwindling escorts. Every month, submarines took more tonnage, and every victory required irreplaceable effort. The admirals who had gathered aboard Shōkaku on August 6th understood this better than anyone. They had seen the arithmetic of extinction, yet duty demanded silence. They planned new offensives, signed orders for raids and convoys, and spoke of victory even as they calculated defeat. Yamamoto's shadow, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, carried the burden of that contradiction. He had warned before the war that Japan could fight the United States for 6 months, maybe a year, but beyond that, victory was impossible. The industrial disparity was simply too great. By 1943, his prophecy was coming true. Yamamoto remained outwardly loyal, directing the ongoing Solomon Islands campaign, but privately he knew the war had turned. His letters, later found in archives, spoke of inevitable decline and the need for honorable endurance. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans. A squadron of P-38 Lightnings ambushed his plane over Bougainville. Yamamoto's death was both symbolic and strategic, the loss of the only Japanese commander who truly understood the futility of the war. The empire had lost not just its most capable admiral, but its last realist. The iron laws of war. As the months unfolded, the trends the admirals had predicted accelerated. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, confirmed what Yamaguchi and Fukuda had foreseen. Japan's air arm was finished. Hundreds of inexperienced pilots were slaughtered against superior American training and radar coordination. By then, the United States had achieved total naval dominance. The Essex-class carriers, once theoretical, now formed massive task forces. Waves of fighters and bombers darkened the sky over every contested island. Each battle became an industrial equation. How many tons of fuel, bullets, and planes could be produced, shipped, and expended faster than the enemy? America's answer was always more. Japan, constrained by geography and resources, could only retreat. The empire that had stretched across Asia was collapsing back toward its own shores. The home front cracks. At home, civilians began to feel the cost. Food shortages, rationing, and nightly air raid drills replaced the early euphoria of victory. Factories worked without materials. Power outages became routine. The propaganda spoke of divine destiny, but hunger and funerals told another story. The same aircraft plants that once boasted elite engineers now employed teenage girls assembling planes without enough aluminum. Pilots trained on wooden mock-ups because there was no fuel for real flight. The phrase whispered in the Navy, "We have ships but no oil," had become the nation's reality. And still, the government refused to yield. The ideology of total sacrifice, of death before surrender, consumed reason. Every sign of dissent was crushed. Every honest report buried. Japan's leadership had chosen annihilation over admission. The reckoning. The admirals who had met in Truk Lagoon did not survive the war as a group. Yamaguchi had already been lost at Midway, refusing rescue from his sinking carrier Hiryu. Others were killed in later battles or faded into silence after surrender. But history preserved their realization. The minutes of their August 1942 meeting, reconstructed from scattered testimonies and surviving notes, reveal a moment of rare clarity amid national delusion. Long before atomic fire or surrender documents, these men saw the outcome written in numbers. Production, oil, tonnage, time. They understood that Pearl Harbor had been a brilliant strike aimed at America's body, but it had struck its soul instead. By awakening the United States to total war, Japan had guaranteed its own destruction. The final truth. Looking back, the story of that August meeting is not merely one of defeat but of inevitability. Strategy could not overcome economics. Courage could not replace fuel. Pride could not outbuild industry. The admirals aboard Shōkaku were not traitors or prophets. They were soldiers trapped inside a machine already doomed by its first move. Their awareness changed nothing, but it recorded something vital. The moment Japan's leaders finally saw the truth their nation would not admit for 3 more years. August 6, 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, 2 months after Midway, was the day Japan's admirals knew they had already lost the Pacific War. And yet, duty demanded they keep fighting a war that could not be won.